The Mercy General Hospital. The emergency department on a Tuesday night in November smelled the way all emergency rooms smell: antiseptic over something older, something human and undefeated. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency just above the threshold of conscious annoyance, and the intake desk was a sea of clipboards, coffee cups, and the particular brand of exhausted impatience that accumulates in triage nurses like sediment. It was into this ordinary chaos that Margaret N. Holloway walked at precisely 7 in the evening, pulling on a pair of blue nitrile gloves before she had even fully passed through the staff entrance. She was a compact woman, 43 years old, with blonde hair gone mostly silver at the temples, and gray eyes that moved across a room, the way a contractor's eyes move across a building, assessing load-bearing walls before the drywall goes up. She wore her scrubs the way some women wear a second skin, without vanity and without apology. Her name badge said only Holloway, RN. She signed in at the board, picked up her assignment sheet, and got to work. Nobody at Mercy General knew a great deal about Margaret Holloway. She had been there 14 months. Transferred from a hospital in San Antonio that nobody had thought to ask much about. She was quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, not shy, not unfriendly, but economical, as though she had long ago identified exactly how many words a situation required and had resolved to use no more than that. She lived alone in a rental house on the east side of town. She drove a used Ford F-150 with 140,000 miles on it. She brought her own lunch in a dented green thermos, and she always, without exception, took the worst shifts. The overnight on Christmas, the double New Year's, the Saturday when half the staff called in sick and the waiting room looked like a bus terminal. The younger nurses had noticed her. Of course, it would have been impossible not to, but what they noticed, they didn't particularly admire. Dr. Caleb Prescott, the department's senior attending, a 38-year-old from Connecticut, with a jaw like a compass, heading in the effortless confidence of a man who had never once doubted that rooms rearranged themselves around him, had noticed Margaret in his own particular way. He noticed that she was slow, not dangerously slow. Her patients were always stable, always properly documented, always medicated on time, but slow in the way that a careful person is slow, which to a fast person looks indistinguishable from incompetence. She read labels twice. She asked patients to repeat their medication histories even when the chart was right in front of her. And she had a habit of sitting on the edge of a patient's bed and simply talking to them for a few minutes before beginning any procedure, as though she believed the conversation itself was part of the medicine. Holloway's running behind on bed 7 again, Dr. Prescott said one evening in early November, not bothering to lower his voice, addressing charge nurse Kayla Simmons while Margaret was fully within earshot. Kayla, 26 and newly promoted, pressed her lips together in a diplomatic line. She liked Margaret, but she also liked her position, and she understood the calculus of the situation with perfect clarity. She nodded at the doctor. Margaret, at the supply cart 10 feet away, continued counting syringes with the same steady, unhurried hands. The resident, a young man named Dr. Tyler Walsh, fresh out of his intern year and still carrying the brittle confidence of someone who hadn't yet been broken and reassembled by the job, laughed behind his hand. He was the one who'd started calling her the Glacier in the break room. Not to her face. He wasn't that reckless, but in the way that nicknames spread in closed environments. It had gotten back to her within a week. Margaret had said nothing. She had simply continued doing what she did, showing up before her shift, leaving after it, and taking care of every patient assigned to her with an exactness that left no room for error, even if it left precious little room for speed. On the night of November the 14th, the ambulance bay doors burst open at 8:47 p.m., and everything Margaret Holloway was changed forever, at least in the eyes of Mercy General. The paramedics came through at a run, rattling a gurney that held a young man in olive-drab military clothing, blood soaking through a field dressing on his left thigh. That someone, some good and quick sinking, someone had applied before. The ambulance arrived. The man was conscious. He was perhaps 25, crouched, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been trained to endure pain without making a sound about it and was currently making a sound about it anyway, because the pain was considerable. His name, per the paramedics' report, was Specialist Aaron Cole, 82nd Airborne, home on leave. He had been in a vehicle accident on Route 9. And the femoral involvement was a question mark that nobody in that room wanted to answer. Wrong. Dr. Prescott moved toward the gurney with his usual authority. Kayla fell in beside him. The resident trailed. And Margaret Holloway, who had been charting at the nurse's station, was already on her feet and moving, not fast, not slow, but with a directional certainty that parted the crowded hallway like water around the prow of a ship. She reached the gurney before Tyler Walsh did. She placed one gloved hand on Specialist Cole's arm, and something happened that nobody could quite describe afterward. The young soldier, who had been gripping the gurney rails with white knuckles and breathing in the ragged, controlled way of a man managing fear by sheer discipline, looked up at her face and went still. Not calm, not fully, but still. His breathing slowed by 1 full count. His grip loosened by 1 degree. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he recognizes in a place he didn't expect to find it. "I've got you, specialist," she said, in a voice that was not loud and not soft and was aimed at exactly one person. "You're going to be fine. I need you to breathe with me." He breathed with her. Dr. Prescott was already calling for imaging and a vascular consult, already performing the choreography of emergency medicine with practiced grace. But for just a moment, just that one suspended moment in a busy emergency bay on a November night, it was Margaret Holloway and Aaron Cole in a world of two, and he was following her lead the way. A soldier follows a voice he trusts, which is not the same as the way a patient follows a nurse. Nobody in that hallway caught it. Nobody. That is, except Aaron Cole himself, who knew exactly what he was seeing, and would tell them all before the night was over. The first hour with specialist Aaron Cole was organized chaos of the most professional kind. The vascular surgeon, Dr. Renee Park, revived from upstairs within 9 minutes of the page and confirmed that the femoral artery was intact. A piece of luck so substantial that Dr. Prescott actually exhaled audibly and touched the bridge of his nose, as though offering a small, private prayer of relief. The thigh wound was deep and would require a thorough, clean, and a significant number of sutures. But the young soldier was not going to lose his leg, and he was not going to bleed. Out in Bay 3 of the Mercy General Emergency Department, and the entire room seemed to exhale in collective acknowledgement of this fact. Aaron Cole, for his part, had taken hold of the situation with the same hands that had let go of panic when Margaret spoke to him. He answered every question clearly, reported his pain on a scale of 7, refused morphine twice before accepting it on the third offer, and kept his eyes tracking the room in a way that wasn't fear so much as professional habit. Margaret was assigned to prep the wound and establish the FRXs, which she did with the double-checking thoroughness that had earned her the nickname she wore without comment. She cleaned the site. She checked her materials. She talked to Aaron while she worked, not chatter, not distraction technique, but actual conversation, asking him where he was stationed, how long he'd been home, whether his family had been notified. Tyler Walsh was assisting Dr. Park across the bay and had occasion to glance over twice. Both times, he saw Margaret Holloway working with a focus so absolute it looked almost meditative, and Aaron Cole talking to her with an ease that was unusual in a patient this acutely injured. The resident filed this away without fully knowing what to do with it. It was during the wound cleaning, Margaret working with a saline-soaked gauze and small, precise circles that were slow enough to be thorough and firm enough to be effective, that Aaron Cole spoke the words that would reorder the evening. He had been watching her hands, and then he looked up at her face, and he said it quietly, almost carefully, as though testing whether the room was listening. Most of it wasn't. Dr. Park was speaking with Kayla. Dr. Preskin was at the board, updating the chart. Tyler Walsh was the only other person within earshot, and he almost missed it because he was looking at his phone. "You were 75th Rangers," Aaron said. Not a question. His voice was low, certain. "The way you identify something you're sure of. The way you move. The way you checked that dressing when we came in. I've seen Rangers work a trauma. You were combat." Medical Margaret did not stop moving. The gauze continued its careful circles. A few seconds passed, and then she said, in that same measured, unhurried voice, "Keep still, please." Another pause. "Yes." Just the one word. She said it the way she said most things, without ornamentation, without apparent need for it to land anywhere in particular. But Tyler Walsh had looked up from his phone. He stood very still in the way of someone who has just heard something they don't quite believe, and is trying to decide whether they imagined it. Aaron Cole looked at the ceiling for a moment, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite grief. It was probably some alloy of both that combat veterans produce sometimes, when they recognize one another in civilian spaces. He said, "What was your rank?" Margaret was applying fresh gauze now. She pressed it into place with both thumbs, applied exactly the right pressure, held it for the count of 3. "Lieutenant Colonel," she said. "Retired." 3 words. She said them the way she might have said any other clinical fact, as though they required no more weight than a dosage or a blood pressure reading, which was, in its own quiet way, the most impressive thing about it. Tyler Walsh put his phone in his pocket. He looked across the bay at Dr. Preskin, who was still at the board, still writing, still unaware. He looked at Margaret Holloway, who had moved on to setting the 4-line with the same unhurried, double-checking precision she applied to everything. "Lieutenant Colonel, 75th Ranger Regiment. Combat medical officer. 14 months in this emergency department, pulling the worst shifts, absorbing the worst jokes, never once offering a syllable of explanation or something." The fancy Tyler Walsh was 29 years old and had been raised to believe that competence announced itself. He was beginning to understand, in the cramped clarity of Bay 3, that the most dangerous competence was the kind that felt no need to. It was another 20 minutes before Dr. Prescott became aware that something had shifted in the atmospheric pressure of his department. He noticed it first in Tyler Walsh, who was moving differently, not faster, not differently skilled, but with a new attentiveness when Margaret spoke, a quality of listening that hadn't been there before. Then Prescott noticed that Kayla had stopped checking her tablet and was watching the bay. He followed her gaze. Margaret was completing Aaron Cole's chart with her usual thoroughness, running down the checklist in the order she always ran it, and the young soldier was watching her with an expression that Dr. Prescott, with his Connecticut education and his considerable clinical experience, did not have an immediate diagnostic category for. It was something like reverence. It was something like recognition. It was the way soldiers sometimes look at the people who carried them out of bad places. Prescott walked to the bay. He stood at the foot of the gurney. Aaron Cole's eyes moved to him, assessed him the way the soldier assessed every new person in his environment, quickly, professionally, without hostility, and then moved back to Margaret. "She'll take good care of you," Prescott asked, in the collegial, slightly patronizing tone of the senior physician checking on the junior nurse's work. It was reflexed. He didn't mean anything particular by it. Aaron Cole looked at him then, with an expression that was perfectly polite and completely clear. "Lieutenant Colonel Holloway has been taking excellent care of me, sir," he said. He let the rank sit there in the air of Bay 3 like a flare over a dark field. "You're lucky to have her." Dr. Kayla Prescott went very still. He had the particular stillness of an intelligent person absorbing information that requires rapid internal reorganization. He looked at Margaret, who was initialing the bottom of the chart with the same efficient penmanship she used for every chart, who had not looked up, who gave absolutely no indication that the last 10 seconds had been different from any other 10 seconds in her shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarmed and was silenced, and Dr. Prescott stood at the foot of bed 3 and began, for the first time in 14 months, to actually look at the woman he had been too busy dismissing. It came out in pieces, the way truth usually does in hospitals, where everyone is too busy to stop and tell a whole story, but where the fragments accumulate in break rooms and hallways and the quiet stretches between crises. By midnight, Kayla Simmons had done what nurses do when they need information. She had searched methodically, using every resource available to her, which in the modern era included a combination of public military records, a LinkedIn page that had not been updated in 3 years, and a conversation with Gary Holt in hospital administration, who had processed Margaret Holloway's hiring paperwork, and who, now that someone was asking, remembered that her references had included a 2-star general and a deputy commander of Special Operations Command, which he had not, at the time, known what to do with, and had therefore simply filed. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ann Holloway had served 21 years in the United States Army. She had deployed 4 times, twice to Afghanistan, once to Iraq, once to a location that the public records were notably vague about in the specific way that special operations deployments tend to be. She had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment as a battalion surgeon, a role that, in the Rangers, is not a desk position, is not a safe position, and is not a role that is offered to anyone who is merely good at medicine. She had been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for actions during a 2009 engagement in Kunar Province, in which she had treated 11 casualties under direct enemy fire, maintaining a casualty survival rate of 100%. She had been awarded the Purple Heart in 2011 for wounds sustained in Helmand Province. She had been promoted to lieutenant colonel in 2015, 1 year below the zone, which is the Army's way of saying that the people above you have noticed you and are not willing to wait. She had retired in 2019. The reason for the retirement was not in any public record, but Gary Holt, who was good at his job and occasionally too thorough for anyone's comfort, had noted in her file that her exit physical had flagged a 20% hearing loss in her left ear and a right knee that had been reconstructed twice. She was 43 years old and she had given the Army everything a human body had to give. And then she had gone back to school for a civilian nursing certification and taken a job in the emergency department of a mid-sized hospital in a mid-sized city and started pulling the worst shifts. Kayla sat in the break room at midnight with a cup of tea that had gone cold in this collection of facts, and she thought about what it meant. She thought about Margaret arriving 40 minutes before every shift. She thought about the double-checking, the reading of labels twice, the asking patients to repeat their histories, and understood now that these were not the habits of a slow or uncertain person. They were the habits of a person who had learned, in conditions that Kayla could not fully imagine and did not try to pretend she could, that the difference between a double-checked medication label and a single-checked one was the difference between life and death, and that no amount of civilian calm had recalibrated that calculus for her. In the Rangers, you were slow until you were certain, and then you were fast. Margaret Holloway had simply never stopped being a Ranger. She thought about the sitting on the edge of patients' beds and talking to them, and she thought about 11 casualties in Kunar Province, and she thought that perhaps this too was not slowness, but something else entirely. The insistence of a person who had seen enough of what happened when you treated a human being as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cared for. The talking was not beside the point. For Margaret Holloway, it had always been the point. Tyler Walsh found Kayla in the break room at He poured himself a coffee and sat across from her. And they didn't speak for a moment in the way that two people sometimes don't speak, when they are both processing the same thing. Then he said, "The glacier." He said it the way you say a nickname you wish you could take back. Kayla didn't respond. He drank his coffee. "I started that," he said, "not proud of it." Kayla looked at him. He was young, and had the open, bewildered face of someone to whom the world had just demonstrated that it was considerably larger than his map of it. She thought he would probably be a good doctor in 5 or 6 years, when the map had been redrawn, enough times to stop being a source of confidence and start being a source of humility. In Bay 3, Margaret was checking on Aaron Cole, who was post-suture, post-morphine, and hovering in that gauzy, semi-lucid state that pain medication produces. His leg was immobilized, his chart was complete, and his mother, a woman from Fayetteville, North Carolina, who had driven 3 hours in the dark, was in the waiting room and would be brought back shortly. Margaret sat in the chair beside the gurney and asked him, quietly, how his pain was on a scale of 1 to 10. He said 4. He said that was about right, and that they'd reassess in an hour. He looked at her with the half-masked gaze of the medicated and said, "You should have told them." She shook her head, a small and definitive movement. "Not my job to tell them," she said. He thought about this. "What is your job?" he asked. She looked at him with those gray, assessing eyes and said, "Same as it. Always was. Keep people alive." She meant it as a clinical statement. He received it as the biography that it was. He said, "Hooah," very quietly, the way Rangers say it when they mean something specific by it. She said, "Get some sleep, specialist." She stood, checked his 4 one final time, and walked out of the bay. Dr. Prescott was in the hallway. He was not checking a chart. He was standing in the hallway outside Bay 3 with his hands in his coat pockets, which was not a posture she had ever seen him adopt. And when she came out, he straightened, and she stopped, and they looked at each other in the particular silence that, exists between two people when one of them owes the other an apology that neither of them is yet sure how to navigate. It was a proud man, so it was a private one. The hallway buzzed and beeped around them, and someone down by the nurse's station dropped a clipboard, and the sound cracked through the quiet like a starter pistol. Margaret waited. She was very good at waiting. It was one of the many things she had learned in places Dr. Prescott had never been to her. Caleb Prescott said, "I owe you an apology." He said it without preamble, which was, Margaret would later reflect, the best way he could have done it. A preamble would have given him somewhere to hide. Without one, the words were simply there in the hallway between them, naked and sufficient. She looked at him for a moment. She had eyes that did not rush to fill silences, and she let this one stand for 3 full seconds before she said, "You didn't know?" He said, "I didn't look." This was honest in a way that she respected, and she showed her respect for it by not arguing with it. Because he was right, he hadn't looked. He had seen a middle-aged woman with silver in her hair who checked her supply cart twice and sat on the edges of beds. And he had made every assumption that a man of his particular training and temperament and privilege tends to make about such women, and not one of those assumptions had been in the direction of Kuna Province, or 11 living Rangers, or a bronze star with valor. He had not looked, and she had not told him, and here they were in a buzzing hallway at 1 in the morning with that truth between them like a piece of evidence at a trial neither of them had intended to attend. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. It was a genuine question. She could hear that. Not defensive, not accusatory, but genuinely curious in the way of someone who is trying to rebuild a map from scratch. Margaret considered this for a moment. She had asked herself the same question, in the quiet of her rental house, in the early mornings before her shifts, and she had an answer. She wasn't certain it was an answer he would understand, but she gave it to him anyway, because he had been honest with her, and she believed in reciprocal honesty as a foundational principle. "I didn't come here to be Lieutenant Colonel Hall," she said. "I came here to be a good nurse. If I lead with the rank, I spend my career managing other people's feelings about the rank. I'd rather just do the work." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's either the most disciplined thing I've ever heard or the most stubborn." She said, "In my experience, there's not a lot of daylight between those two things." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that shows up on the faces of people who are too tired to fully commit to an expression. Then he said, "I'd like to buy you a coffee. Not now, clearly not now, but sometime." She studied him. He was, she thought, fundamentally a decent man who had been given too many things to eye solely and had consequently never developed the habit of looking carefully. That was correctable. She had corrected worse. "Sometime," she said, which was not a yes and not a no, and was exactly what the situation warranted. Then she walked back to the nurse's station, picked up her next chart, and returned to work. Over the following weeks, Mercy General Emergency Department underwent the kind of quiet rearrangement that happens, not because anyone calls a meeting or sends a memo, but because the gravity of a situation has shifted and everyone, without being told, reorients themselves to the new center. Tyler Walsh stopped being late to handoff. He started double-checking his own medication labels. Not performatively, but genuinely. having understood in the bond-level way of a lesson that costs you something that there was a reason the thorough people were thorough, he asked Margaret. Once, about Kunar province. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "That's not a break-room conversation." He said, "Fair enough." He didn't ask again, but he listened. After that, when she spoke in clinical settings, with an attentiveness that was qualitatively different from what it had been before, and she noticed this, and it was enough. Kayla Simmons, who was good at her job and getting better at it, made a point of putting Margaret's name forward for the department's trauma team, a designation that carried no extra pay but considerable prestige and responsibility. Dr. Prescott approved the nomination in under an hour, which was his fastest turnaround on any paperwork that year. Margaret accepted the role the way she accepted, everything without excess language, with immediate competence. She ran her first trauma team drill on a Thursday morning in December, and it was observed afterward by nurses who had been in that department for a decade that they had never seen a drill run with such unhurried, absolute clarity. She didn't shout. She didn't rush. She moved through the simulation the way a river moves through a landscape, not fighting the contours but shaping everything around her. And when it was done, every participant knew exactly what they had done, and why, and what they would do differently, and what they would do the same. Aaron Cole was discharged 4 days after admission, walking on crutches with his mother beside him, and a leg that the orthopedic team fully expected to return to 100% function within 6 months. Before he left, he stopped at the nurse's station, which was busy and loud and entirely normal, and asked for Holloway. She came out from the supply room, wiping her hands on a cloth, still wearing the gloves she'd been using for inventory. He was 6 feet tall and built for the work he did, and he stood in front of her on his crutches and looked at her with an expression that was trying to be casual and was instead entirely sincere. "Thank you, Colonel," he said. She said, "It's just Holloway here." He nodded, slowly, in the way of someone accepting the rules of a foreign country. "Thank you, Holloway," he said. She touched his arm, once. Briefly the same way she had touched it in the ambulance bay when he was scared and bleeding. The same firm, reassuring pressure that had slowed his breathing by 1 full count. "Take care of yourself, specialist," she said, "and come back when you're not bleeding." He laughed, which was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound. She watched him and his mother walk to the elevator. Then, she turned, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, picked up her next chart, and went back to being a nurse. There is a kind of hero that announces itself with sound, the speech before the charge, the medal at the ceremony, the moment where the room falls quiet and the music swells, and everyone present understands that they are witnessing valor. And then there's the other kind, the kind that shows up before the shift, the kind that reads the label twice, the kind that sits on the edge of a bed in a loud and indifferent room and makes a frightened person feel that they are, in this moment, the most important thing in the world, which they are, to her, because she was trained that way, and because she chose it, and because some part of her, the deepest and most durable part, has never quite accepted the idea that a life could be anything other than worth fighting for. On the night shift board at Mercy General, written in the same blue dry erase marker as every other name, it said, Holloway RN, nothing more. She had never asked for more, and she would not ask for it now. But the nurses on her team had begun, without any coordination or discussion, to arrive a few minutes early when they were assigned to her section, to double-check their carts, to sit for a moment with their patients before the procedures began. Small things, invisible things, the kind of things that have no name in any official manual, but that save lives quietly, over years, in the way that rivers save valleys. Not dramatically, not visibly, but with the patient, unarguable certainty of something that will outlast the noise around it. They were learning from her. They would go on learning, and she would go on teaching them the only way she had ever taught anything, by doing it herself, without announcement, without hurry, and without stopping.